All right, class, we're continuing in part 5, the 19th century, circa 1800 to 1900. So now we're talking about the Romantic period, which spans from 1820 to 1850. So 1820 to 1840 was defined as the Romantic period. Music, graphic arts, and dress were all affected by this period. Women's magazines such as Godey's Lady's Book and Peterson's Magazine were resourceful pieces of literature used to disseminate style information. The mass production of lace, a very important fabric during this period, allowed for the fabric to be inexpensive and readily available. The 1840s had two advancements that lended to the movement of fashion: a power knitting frame that was developed introducing seamless hosiery and photography. Ready to wear clothing for both men and women continued to grow. However, there were greater limitations to what ready made clothing was available to women. Elements of Romanticism began to appear in women's fashion after the 1820s. Styles from earlier periods, such as neck ruffs, the ferriniere, and the sleeve style, began to reappear. Fashionable colors were given romantic names like Dust of Ruins or Egyptian Earth. After the Revolution of 1848 to 1849, Romanticism declined in France. Cultivating cotton dominated the South in the mid 19th century. Women were confined to the home. There were limitations to the activities of affluent women. Most of their time was spent entertaining in the home for their husbands' guests. Because of their hostess role, the costume was filled with fashionable clothing. The clothing of affluent women was made by seamstresses. Due to the sleeve style of stylish gowns, women who wore these gowns during the 1830s and 1840s were incapable of raising their arms above their heads. Working class women wore practical garments made out of inexpensive fabrics. Their dress was in line with the basic style lines and silhouettes of that period. Perfection was expected of middle class women. Between 1820 and 1825, you will see the transitions from the Empire styles to the Romantic styles. In this transition, the waistline moved just a few inches above the natural waist by 1825. Sleeves also grew larger by this same year. Chemises, drawers, stays, and petticoats were part of a woman's undergarments. Drawers were worn by women of all social classes. Corsets were laced tightly to cinch the waist as dresses silhouettes emphasized small waistlines. Dresses were classified by the time of day or the engagement for which they were worn. Day dresses, walking dresses, and carriage dresses were often indistinguishable. Day dresses had low waistlines, wide sleeves, and full skirts. Necklines were generally V shaped. However, necklines did vary. Day dresses did not have trains. Morning dresses, which was the most formal style, were made of white cotton or fine linen and trimmed with lace or ruffles. Bustles were used at the back of skirts to create fullness. The pelisse is a robe or a version of a day dress. Fabrics used for day dresses included muslins, printed cottons, challis, wool, and batiste. Evening dresses differed by details rather than silhouette. Lower necklines, shorter sleeves, and skirts. Fabrics used included silk, satin, gauze, and organdy. Skirt lengths varied. So sleeve styles varied. Major styles as per Cunnington and Cunnington include styles that were puffed at the shoulder, the Marie sleeve, the demi-gago, the gago or leg of mutton sleeves, and the imbecile or idiot sleeves. So sleeves that were puffed at the shoulder were then attached as a long sleeve which was fitted to the wrist. Decorative epaulets were sometimes placed at the shoulder. The Marie sleeve was full to the wrist, but it tied in intervals with ribbons or bands. The demi-gigo was full from the shoulder to the elbow, then fitted from the elbow to the wrist, often with an extension over the wrist. The gago, also called leg of mutton sleeves, was full at the shoulder, gradually decreasing in size to the wrist where they ended in a fitted cuff. The imbecile or idiot sleeves were extremely full from the shoulder to the wrist where they gathered into a fitted cuff. The name imbecile was derived from the fact that its construction was similar to that of sleeves used on sort of like a straitjacket. So other garments were used to accessorize dresses and give them a different or another look. Chemisettes or tuckers were used to raise the necklines of daytime dresses. Since they were a separate piece, they could be worn with different bodices. Wide cape-like collars that extended over the shoulders and down across the bosom, called pelerines, were quite popular. The fichu pelerine, a variant of the pelerine, had two wide panels or lappets extending down the front of the dress and passed under the belt. Other popular accessories were the santon, a silk cravat worn over a ruff, and the canezou. The a la chinoise was a hairstyle that was created by pulling the hair back and into a top knot. Hair around the temples and the forehead were arranged in curls. Day caps and bonnets were worn. Capote, which was a soft fabric hat where the crown of the hat was soft and the brim was stiff, were also worn. Flowers, ribbons, feathers, etc. adorned the hair. Two-piece dress ensembles consisting of a jacket and a skirt were worn. Although this particular cut was not dominant, the gilet chez la corsage was a popular cut which resembled a man's waistcoat. The bishop sleeve was made of a row of vertical pleats at the shoulder that released into a soft full sleeve gathered to a fitted cuff at the wrist. It was popular until about 1840. Skirts were full. Fullness was gathered into the waist. Innovations in skirt constructions from about 1840 included edging the skirt hems with a braid to prevent wear and sewing pockets into skirts. Trimmings included ruchings, pleated or gathered strips of fabrics, clones, scallops, and cordings. Evening dresses were made with off-the-shoulder necklines that stretched straight across the encore. Many evening dresses also had berthas. Hair was worn in sausage-shaped curls, plaits, or the hair encircled the ears in the front. Hair was then pulled back into a bun at the back of the head. Hair accessories were preferred for evening wear. Bonnets were the dominant hat shape. Draw bonnets, capteau, and small bonnets were worn. Sunbonnets with bevelets protected the face of women from the sun. So shawls or mantles replaced the pelisse. A mantle or a shawl mantle, which was a short garment that was pretty much like a hybrid between a shawl and a short mantle that had points hanging down at either side of the front. The pelerine mantelet was a deep cape that came well over the elbows and had long, broad front lappets that were worn over and not under a belt. The burnous was a large mantle of about 3/4 length. It was hooded. The name and the style of this garment was derived from a similar garment that was worn by Arabs who lived in the Middle Eastern deserts. The palto was about knee length and had 3 capes and slits for the arms. And the pardessus is a term that was applied to any of a number of garments for outdoor wear that had a defined waistline and sleeves that were from 1.5 to 3/4 in length. In the 1820s and 1830s, women wore gold chains with lockets, scented bottles, or crosses were attached. Chatelaines were ornamental chains that were worn at the waist from which they were suspended. Useful items such as scissors, thimbles, buttons, hooks, and penknives were suspended from these chains. Other items that were in wide use were brooches, bracelets, armlets, and drop earrings. By the 1840s, less jewelry was being worn. In part, influenced by the Romantics as well as Queen Victoria's prolonged period of mourning, clothing and jewelry was increasingly used to depict mourning. So tailcoats and the frock coat were the most popular type of coat. There was the style that was termed military, which was a variation of the frock coat, and it was worn by civilians, but it definitely had evident military influences. This particular garment had a rolled or standing collar and no lapel. Waistcoats were single or double breasted. In the 1820s, single breasted coats dominated for daytime wear. Garments were color contrasted. This was popular during the 1820s. So new coat styles included a riding or a Newmarket coat, which differed from the tailcoat in that the coat sloped gradually to the back from well above the waist, rather than having a squared open area in the front. Jacket styles were single-breasted with or without a seam at the waist. Jackets did have side pleats, but they did not have a back vent. Breeches, front fly closures replaced the fall closures. Breeches were now limited to sportswear and ceremonial full dress as of the 1840s. Waistcoats lengthened and developed at a point in the front called the hussar, which was a front or a beak. Lapels narrowed and were less curved. Front fly closures replaced all fall closures. The Spencer was no longer in style after the 1820s. Great coats, which was a general term for overcoats that had lapels or in some cases did not. They were single and double breasted, floor length, and they had collars with deep rolls. Box coats were large, loose greatcoats with one or more capes at the shoulder. So some new terminology came about around the 1830s. So the term palto was first used in the 1830s The styles to which this term was applied definitely varied over time. At this period, appears to have been a short greatcoat that was either single or double breasted with a small flat collar and lapels. Sometimes it had a waist seam and sometimes it did not. So Chesterfield was named after the sixth Earl of Chesterfield. He was an influential man in the English social life in the 1830s and 40s. The term Chesterfield was first used in the 1840s and applied to a coat that was either single or double breasted clothing. The double breasted version is more closely associated with this term. The coat had no waistline seam. A short vent was in the back, but it did not have side pleats, and often there was a velvet collar. The Macintosh was a waterproof coat made of rubber and cut like a short, loose overcoat. This was a new garment that was named after its inventor, Charles Macintosh. So, waterproof cloaks are also mentioned throughout this text. These early Macintoshes did not meet with universal approval, and the waterproof garments returned to favor in the 1850s with the peak in popularity in the 1880s and 1890s. So the Gibber's hat was a collapsible top hat for evening wear. It was named after its inventor. This was fitted with a spring so that the hat could be folded flat and carried under the arm. The derby hat or the bowlers begun to be worn at the close of the period. These hats had stiff, round, bowl-shaped crowns with narrow brims. Caps were favored for sports in particular. Beards were worn in the 1825s with small whiskers. Men also wore their hair short to moderate lengths with loose curls or waves. Men wore very little jewelry other than items like the cravat pins, brooches, watches, or jeweled shirt buttons, and also studs and or decorative gold watch chains and watches. Bedroom slippers were worn in the home. Gloves were also worn. Now, the first row of shoes were actually made around 1832. So, girls wore dresses that were similar to that of women, but they were shorter in length and had a low neckline and short sleeves. White lace trimmed drawers or legits, a sort of half pantalette that tied around the leg, were also worn under dresses. Slippers as well as high ankle boots were worn and white stockings. Bonnets, hats, or starched lingerie caps were worn outdoors. For boys, the skeleton suit was worn until about 1830. The Eton suit was considered a short, single breasted jacket that ended at the waist. The front was cut square and the lapels were wide with a turned down collar. The suit was completed with a necktie, vest, or a waistcoat, as well as trousers. This style was actually derived from the schoolboy clothing that was worn at Eton School in England. This suit did have some minor variations, however, it remained a basic style for young boys for the rest of the century. The tunic suit consisted of a jacket that was fitted to the waist, where it attached to a full gathered or pleated skirt that ended at the knee. It did button down the front and had a wide belt. Usually it was worn with trousers, but there are some versions for small boys ages 3 to 6 that combine the tunic jacket with frilled white drawers. Jackets in combination with trousers were cut like those of adult men. Boys did not wear frock coats or dress coats, however. So the dress of slave women had two different types. So one consisted of a frock or a robe with a simple sleeveless and collarless bodice that joined to the skirt. The other type had a semi-fitted bodice with a round neckline, which was sometimes attached to the collar. It also had long, loose sleeves and a gathered skirt. So more fashionable attire was given to slaves who worked in the home. Fabrics that were used to create their clothing was more harsh and coarse and also pretty plain. Generally, they only received about 2 outfits per year, and that was one to get them through the warm weather months, and the second to get them through the cold weather months. Slave men wore loose fitted shirts over their loose pantaloons or short breeches. Children wore a garment resembling a long shirt. Slaves did personalize their garments when possible by using trimmings, dyeing them, or even making their own clothing or purchasing extra clothing.